Today we are going to look at famines throughout history. In an essay on the principle of population, Thomas Malthus in 1826 wrote, "The effects of nature's check on man are complicated. Impelled to the increase of his species, an equally powerful instinct, reason interrupts his career and asks whether he may not bring beings into the world for whom he cannot provide the means of support. If he hear not this suggestion, the human race will be constantly endeavoring to increase beyond the means of subsistence. But as by that law of our nature which makes food necessary to the life of man, population can never actually increase beyond the lowest nourishment capable of supporting it. A strong check on population, namely, the difficulty of acquiring food, must be constantly in operation." Ready access to food is always an urgent concern. As hunter-gatherers, semi-nomadic ancestors of modern humans experienced relatively few food shortages by tracking and hunting migrating animal herds to feed smaller populations. The prevalence of agriculture resulted in permanent settlements and population increase, along with dependence on abundant crop yields. With this innovation, the largely human-created problem of famine has indelibly marked human experience and subjected people to the whims of climate change in new and often serious ways. The ever-present threat of famine predates the earliest surviving written accounts, but we present to you the following devastation from the 2nd millennium BC. The 4.2 kiloyear BP aridification event was a severe climatic event. It started in 2200 BC and most likely lasted the entire century. It greatly reduced rainfall for areas of North Africa, the Middle East, Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and the middle of North America. Agricultural food production would have been severely reduced. It is suggested by some experts that the aridification event facilitated the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt. Additional casualties are thought to be the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia and the Langshu culture in the lower Yangtze River area. The resulting drought may also have triggered a collapse of the Indus Valley civilization and could have been the cause of Indo-European speaking people moving to India. The Persian Gulf also shows evidence of having been affected by the aridification event. After 2200 BC, there is a change in settlement patterns and pottery styles. The style of burial also changed. Somewhere around 2200 BC, the al-Nur culture that inhabited this area disappeared and the Wadi Suk culture arrived. Drought and resulting food shortages are thought to be the catalyst that ended the al-Nur at this location. Most ancient civilizations in the affected areas seem to have been unable to adapt to changing climate conditions successfully. Rapid environmental change without modern technology to compensate was very deadly in the ancient world. Crop yields did not always provide a large surplus, and even if they did, long-term food storage was difficult. Environmental issues also proved disastrous in the years 535 to 536 AD. It was initially believed that a large volcanic eruption occurred in 535, most likely in a tropical region. It has been suggested that the eruption caused dust particles to diffuse throughout the atmosphere. This blocked sunlight for several months. Whether or not a volcano was the root cause, there was most definitely a severe but short period of cooling in the northern hemisphere during these years. It disrupted weather patterns all over the world, which resulted in crop failures. Shortly thereafter, populations decreased as starvation progressed. Some evidence of the dust cloud can be found from the writings of Byzantine historian Procopius. In 536 AD, in a report concerning war with the Vandals, he wrote, "During this year a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear." Scientific evidence also exists which confirms many theories about this disaster. Dendrochronologist Mike Bailey examined tree rings for Irish oak and found a decrease in growth in 536. Similar patterns were also discovered from trees in Sweden, Finland, California, and Chile. In addition to trees, ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland from around 535 were examined and found to contain sulfates. This suggests that an acidic veil may have surrounded the area until parts of it settled on the ice, which helps prove that the volcanic eruption theory is likely correct. A 2015 study further supported the theory of a volcanic eruption in 535 or 536, but it placed the location of the volcano in North America rather than the tropics. The ancestral Puebloans were a Native American civilization that also suffered through famine events. They inhabited areas which are currently located in the United States. The area in which their settlements have been found include southeastern Utah, northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, and southwestern Colorado. Their civilization collapsed due to famine sometime between 1275 and 1299 AD. The archaeological evidence shows that it was not uncommon for the Puebloans to migrate to various locations as climate shifted. Many of the sites examined were occupied for 30 years or less. It appeared that the inhabitants would occupy the areas during periods of above-average rainfall when crops could be grown without irrigation. Nearby areas that experienced below-average rainfall would be abandoned, a further indication that migration was a common strategy for the Puebloans. Around 1130, North America experienced an event known as the Great Drought, which lasted for 300 years. This is thought to have been a partial explanation for why the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their settlements in the 13th century. Some Puebloan villages relocated from canyons to mesas in the late 13th century. The most likely reason to move away from water and arable land was to better defend against enemies. Environmental pressures quite likely pushed many isolated communities to raid others for food rather than grow their own during this time. Although climate change created the initial conditions for famine, violence between groups became almost equally important in spreading its impacts. Famine found its way to Europe many times, but one of the most notable is the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Almost all of Europe was affected, and the event caused millions to die over a period of several years. Before it was over, people had resorted to eating seed grain and slaughtering draft animals for food. Also, children were often left to fend for themselves, and the elderly began to refuse food so that the young could survive. Recovery of food production did not begin until after 1322. The Great Famine started when bad weather in the spring of 1315 resulted in crop failures. Crop failures continued until the summer harvest in 1317. The interim period was very unpleasant. It produced extremely high levels of crime and disease. Even cannibalism and infanticide were common during these years. The start of the famine coincided with the end of the medieval warm period. This was an extremely warm period from about 950 AD to 1250 AD. Once the warm period ended, Europe experienced rainy, cold summers and extremely cold winters. There are some experts who suspect that the cause could be a volcanic eruption. A likely candidate is Mount Tarawera in New Zealand. As we have seen in other examples, human behavior multiplies the effect of climate-caused famines. Population at the start of the Great Famine was at an all-time high, and medieval governments were completely ineffective in handling the crises. There was very little margin to handle a sudden drop in food production, so starvation arrived quickly once the crops failed. Even the elite members of society could not escape the effects. Medieval Europe encountered famines frequently, even though most were not as severe as the Great Famine. Most people in these societies seldom had enough to eat. For instance, according to official records about the English royal family, the average life expectancy in 1276 was 35.28 years. This is only slightly higher than life expectancy in hunter-gatherer groups, which according to some sources averages 33 years. In one documented incident, Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans in August of 1315. The king could not find bread for himself or his entourage. Apparently, in medieval Europe, even kings could not find food at times. As a result, the nobility was also vulnerable to the same diseases that threatened the lower classes. By the 19th century, most famines that occurred were the result of government policies. Although crop failures still happened, food production typically far exceeded consumption. Economic decisions, however, could often create shortages that would have otherwise never existed. The Great Famine in Ireland, also known as the Irish Potato Famine, occurred from 1845 to 1849. During the famine, around 1 million people died, and another million left the country. The initial cause was a potato blight that affected crops all over Europe during the 1840s. Around 100,000 deaths occurred outside of Ireland as a result, demonstrating that Ireland was not the only place that had to deal with crop failures. The reason why so many Irish died, unfortunately, is that economic policies created additional shortages. Throughout the entire famine, Ireland was exporting enormous quantities of food. In an issue of History Ireland from 1997, Christine Keneally, a True University professor, related some shocking details concerning her research into the topic. During 1847, almost 4,000 transport ships carried food from the ports of Ireland to various ports in England. Exports of calves, livestock, bacon, and ham actually increased during the worst part of the famine. Some other items that were exported for economic reasons during this time were peas, beans, onions, rabbits, salmon, oysters, herring, lard, honey, and seed. Even more incredible is the amount of butter Ireland exported while its people died from starvation. In the first 9 months of 1847, 2,314,000 liters of butter were shipped to several ports in England. Although crop failures were an issue, Ireland clearly had diversity in food production. It should have been able to successfully feed its people during this time. The economic policies which resulted in Ireland exporting so much food meant that food was available, but most people simply couldn't afford it. Unbridled capitalism is not the only economic system which creates unnecessary food shortages. The Russian famine of 1921 to 1922 was, much like Ireland, the result of crop failures combined with policies that exacerbated the situation. This was also known as the Powolsky famine, and killed an estimated 5 million people. The lower classes frequently resorted to cannibalism to survive. A number of factors contributed to the start of the famine. The Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War were ongoing, which meant that troops had to be fed. And thanks to the conflicts, rail transport was unreliable. Thus, there were issues transporting food to areas that needed it. The policy of war communism was also a huge contributor, as the government confiscated food and redistributed it according to standards that did not necessarily take starving peasants into account. An intermittent drought in 1921 made the situation even worse. At one point, international relief agencies that were trying to help had to give food to railroad staff just to ensure supplies were transported at all. Before the famine ended, the United States had also sent enough food and medicine for 11 million people. However, during this international relief effort, the Soviet government continued to export grain to try to revive industry. Economic policies clearly offset any benefit provided by international assistance. By contrast to other systems of government, it is interesting to note that a major famine has not happened under any modern democratic systems. This doesn't mean that they are immune to famine, but rather that government policies don't appear to increase the severity of problems when shortages occur. Some experts theorize that because leaders in democratic societies have to be elected to keep their positions, they are more highly motivated to prevent widespread starvation. Essentially, democratic systems provide a direct relationship between the well-being of the people and self-preservation of the leaders. Most authoritarian systems of government lack this feedback mechanism. In many ways, the discovery of agriculture was not beneficial where the quality of human life was concerned. Hunter-gatherers certainly lived a difficult life, but it was also much more consistent in terms of food availability. For much of the history of civilization, people have experienced periods of surplus followed by periods of starvation. Since crops and livestock were the only way to support large communities, climate change in the ancient world could eliminate food surpluses with a single failure. As populations increased and systems of government became more specialized in the Middle Ages, it became possible to better manage food shortages. But the governments did not use their power to do that. Instead, they either ignored problems or increased their severity. Even in modern times, when food production can easily create surpluses, governments have sometimes redirected shipments and created famine where none would exist otherwise. And in any time in human history, warfare could cause food supply issues as well. Between unpredictable climate shifts, diseases that affect food crops, warfare, and bad economic policies, it would seem the fact that most people do not starve today is an anomaly by historical standards. This conclusion also seems to be supported by Malthus, who wrote in the first essay, "Famine seems to be the last, the most dreadful resource of nature. The power of population is so superior to the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction." Malthus wrote this in 1798, however. Had he seen how modern agriculture works, he may have focused more on the vices of mankind. Thanks to modern technology, we can store food surpluses for many years. A single crop failure should not cause widespread famine thanks to the global economy and modern distribution methods. Plus, most countries in the world promote economic policies which do not result in starvation among their own citizens. Clearly, some countries in the world still experience famine. Most of these are caused almost entirely by warfare and authoritarian systems of government, although the role of climate cannot be underestimated. Centralized control of food production and distribution seems to often be a precursor of starvation, however. Do you think that spreading democracy could help reduce famine? Or will climate change eventually overwhelm its ability to manage food shortages? Alternatively, have democratic systems simply gotten lucky so far? Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.